Hello, everyone. Welcome to European Values Center for Security Policies, a webinar on the UN Resolution 2758. The theme for today's discussion is 404, Taiwan Not Found. And in today's conversation, featuring three experts on Chinese lawfare and legal issues related to Taiwan and China, we are going to focus primarily on China's malign distortion of the UN General Assembly Resolution 2758. This short document, which contains 155 words, does not mention Taiwan at all. Therefore, why does Taiwan use the document to justify exclusion of Taiwan from international organizations? My name is Marcin Jerzewski, and I'm the head of Taiwan office at the European Values Center for Security Policy. In 2022, our think tank became the first European think tank to establish a permanent office in Taiwan. And I am very honored to serve as the inaugural head of this operation, which allows us to explore a number of issues under the broader aegis of Taiwan-Europe relations. And definitely issues related to China's legal warfare are also relevant to European audiences, also with regard to UN Resolution 2758, as evidenced by recent action by European legislatures to call out the distortion of the document. Passed in 1971, the document transferred China's seat at the United Nations from the representatives of Chiang Kai-shek to the People's Republic of China. Yet the resolution does not address the issue of Taiwan's sovereignty, nor does it proscribe the island nations' participation in international fora. Yet the resolution has become instrumentalized by Beijing, which actively seeks to limit Taiwan's international space by distorting the meaning of the resolution and equating it with its unilateral One China principle. Without further ado, I would now like to introduce the three experts who very generously decided to share their insights on the issue with our global audience. The webinar will proceed as follows. I will first invite the three speakers to deliver short opening remarks of about 5 minutes each. I will then moderate a discussion between our three experts so that they can respond to each other's remarks and further explore some of the key issues related to Chinese distortion of UN 2758, which they will describe. And in the very final part of today's 60-minute session, we will also engage with the questions from the audience. So to all of our audience members watching us on YouTube or on Facebook, please make sure to drop your questions in the chat section or in the comments. Our team is on standby to review your questions and bring them to our experts. First, we will start with remarks by Dr. Yujie Chen, Associate Research Professor at the Institutum Jurisprudentiae of Academia Sinica. Dr. Chen is an Associate Research Professor at the Institute and a non-resident affiliated scholar at the U.S. Asia Law Institute at the NYU School of Law. She specializes in international law and human rights, with a particular focus on China, Taiwan, and their relations. Her work spans 5 interconnected areas: China's authoritarian political and legal system, its influence on international human rights regime, the national security legal regime in Hong Kong, legal controversies in China-Taiwan relations, and Taiwan's engagement with international law. Dr. Chen's scholarship and commentary have appeared in the United States, Europe, Australia, Hong Kong, and Taiwan, including the China Quarterly, New York Times, and Australian Foreign Affairs. We will then hear from Mr. Luc de Pulford, Executive Director at the Interparliamentary Alliance on China. Luc is the founder and executive director of the Interparliamentary Alliance on China, which comprises more than 290 members from 41 legislatures around the world to push for democratic countries to reform policy on China. He previously co-founded the anti-slavery charity Arise, which he ran from its inception until 2022. Last but not least, we will welcome remarks by Professor Margaret Lewis, who serves as Professor of Law at Seton Hall University. Maggie Lewis's research focuses on China and Taiwan, with an emphasis on criminal justice and human rights, as well as on legal issues in the US-China relationship. She is spending this year on sabbatical as a visiting academic researcher at Melbourne Law School's Asian Law Center. Professor Lewis is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and serves on the National Committee on United States-China Relations Board of Directors, for which she is also a Public Intellectual Program Fellow. She has been a Fulbright Senior Scholar at National Taiwan University, a visiting professor at Academia Sinica, a consultant to the Ford Foundation, and a delegate to the U.S.-Japan Foundation's U.S.-Japan Leadership Program. She's also a non-resident affiliated scholar of New York University School of Law's U.S. Asia Law Institute. Well, now that we are acquainted with our formidable panel, I would like to invite Dr. Yujie Chen to share her opening remarks, commenting on what is the UN 2758 resolution and why is it central to the PRC's campaign to sustain its claim of owning Taiwan. Please.
Thank you, Martin. As a first speaker, I thought it would be useful for me to lay the groundwork for a later discussion. So to do that, I'll start with the basic questions. First, what is UNGA Resolution 2758? And more importantly, what it is not. So what is 2758? I'll refer you to very good reports by German Marshall Fund in 2022 and 2024. They've done a great job explaining what 2758 is. The short story is it is a decision by UNGA to recognize the PRC government as the only lawful representative of the Chinese state in the UN. This is what is usually referred to as the question of China's representation. That is, which government should sit in the China seat at the UN? The question arose because the Republic of China government continued to occupy the China seat in the UN even after the PRC was established in 1949. So every year since 1949, PRC's allies would request the UN to recognize the PRC government as the only legitimate representative of China, replacing the ROC government. And in 1971, the UNGA Resolution 2758 was passed just to do that. The more important question is what it is not, what Resolution 2758 is not. It is not a decision to decide that Taiwan belongs to China. This is a question of Taiwan's legal status, and it's different from the question of the Chinese representation that we just discussed. When UN member states cast their votes in 1971, they decided on which government should be recognized. They did not intend to address who should own Taiwan. As a matter of law, I want to emphasize that the UNGA has no legal authority to transfer Taiwan's sovereign title to China. In fact, back then, Beijing knew as much. China's then Prime Minister Zhou Enlai noted that if 2758 passed, quote, the status of Taiwan is not yet decided, unquote, meaning that the PRC too understood that the resolution did not establish China's sovereignty over Taiwan. And I want to address the second question. Why is Resolution 2758 so important to China's campaign? Because China finds it a useful tool to isolate Taiwan, and isolation is an essential strategy in Beijing's squeezing Taiwan. China misrepresents 2758 as international recognition of its so-called One China principle, claiming that Taiwan is part of China. This misleading, but unfortunately, international organizations, including the United Nations, have been affected by China's distortion. These organizations have time and again, based on Beijing's distortion of 2758, denied Taiwan's request to participate. So Beijing has this agenda of isolation. It's crucial because Taiwan's continuing isolation renders Taiwan vulnerable to China's attempt to control and intimidate. The more isolated Taiwan is, the harder it is for Taiwan to resist China's annexation. I also want to emphasize that China's distortion of 2758 is part of the campaign to internalize Taiwan, so that if there is a future conflict across the Taiwan Strait, Beijing can label international intervention as illegal, thereby preventing international support for Taiwan. This is why it's so important for the international community not to let China continue to isolate Taiwan. Instead, to stop China's aggression, what we can do is to empower Taiwan. That is to not isolate Taiwan and integrate Taiwan into the international system. I know my time is up. I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Yujie, on shedding light on this agenda of isolation, which, as you mentioned, is increasing Taiwan's vulnerability, not only amid its quest to expand its international space, but also in the context of China's growing belligerence in the Taiwan Strait. Moving forward, let's hear from Luke. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Martin. It's a great pleasure to join you. I'm going to bring a political angle and not concentrate too much on some of the legal ins and outs, because I think, as many people watching this video may know, IPAC, the Interparliamentary Alliance on China, has been doing what it can to push back against Beijing's distortion of UN General Assembly Resolution 2758. The reason that we chose to do that is that we came to the view that parliaments have been something of a sleeping giant when it's come to efforts to shape how the international community understands and responds to disinformation, legal manipulation. I think the reason for that is that normally conversations, well, diplomatic conversations are the preserve of governments. You don't normally locate those kinds of conversations within parliaments, although parliamentarians are sometimes a part of those conversations. They don't tend to determine them. And in some parliaments around the world, very explicitly, the government will say, we're not interested in what Parliament thinks about foreign affairs, keep your distance. So we have believed, I think, within the network that parliaments could be a way, and had been an underutilized way of trying to shape this narrative. And they can, because unlike governments, parliaments are not constrained by executive diplomacy or executive policy. They're very powerful platforms for public scrutiny, legislative pressure, cross-party cooperation, international coordination. They also have the legitimacy, the tools, and the independence to disrupt Beijing's disinformation strategies head on. And they can do that very loudly. Parliaments shape the normative environment in their own jurisdictions. What they do is news. And when they want to act, they tell the country for which they are representing that this is something that the country needs to be focusing on. There's a lot to say about that, but I've got limited time. So I think I just want to probe what we've tried to do through IPAC and why. We think that successful parliamentary advocacy, okay, so not like stuff which is very tangential or buried, like parliamentary questions, successful parliamentary advocacy, like passing a motion, that can help to deny Beijing uncontested control of the narrative around Taiwan. And we think it has done that actually through this initiative 2758, partly because, as I've said, what parliaments do is news. It makes news, and therefore there's huge awareness raising benefit to it. It's not like a report which might be produced by an expert, and this is in no way disrespectful to experts. Their work has been totally essential. But it takes something that might have been the preserve of the China research community and propels it into the public political space, gives it political currency. And that's tremendously valuable in the media, but it's also tremendously valuable in the parliamentary context itself, because most members of parliament simply don't know about this. And let's be honest about it. UN Resolution 2758, I think if you'd asked most parliamentarians around most democracies a year ago what it was, 80 to 90% would not have been able to give you an answer. I think the percentage is very much higher in the parliaments that have passed motions now, purely because it was a reasonably big deal in the parliaments where it happened. So there's an awareness raising benefit, not just in the media in that place, because of the legitimacy of parliaments. There's an awareness raising benefit among lawmakers themselves. And that's of tremendous value. I think the reason this is so important on Taiwan is because I have a bit of a mantra when it comes to campaigning on China. When it is about territory, we are losing. So if you look back through various campaigns on China, campaigns to do with human rights in the northwest of China or around Hong Kong, in those situations, many parliamentarians were reluctant to engage. And part of the reason they were is that they felt they were being asked to make a judgment call about a complicated territorial dispute very far away, about which they knew very little. And only when the issue could be translated from this complicated territorial dispute to a question of human rights or something else did we find that parliamentarians found it easier to engage. The difference with 2758 is there's no getting away from the complexity. So the fact that parliaments have passed motions on 2758 tells you a lot about awareness within parliaments over the past 5 years and how much that has changed. We were relatively surprised by the take-up and the appetite for it, but that's all really positive. I'm aware I'm running out of time, so I just want to say that the fact that territorial issues around China are very difficult for foreign MPs in democracies to take up has been exploited by Beijing. You know, they know it's difficult for people to speak about. It's complicated. It requires some knowledge of history, some knowledge of the law. And against that background, the fact that Beijing can therefore continue to push these boundaries and use their diplomatic, economic leverage to force people to accept their interpretation means that we've had this kind of creeping expansion of Beijing's understanding or Beijing's proposed interpretation of 2758. And we've seen that play out recently in IPAC, by the way, because we've had 3 countries bullied out of the network by the PRC. In every case, they were forced, the co-chairs of IPAC, to resign from IPAC and to make a public pronouncement about the one China principle, clearly dictated to them, by the way, by the People's Republic of China's representatives in their countries. So very clearly, when there is pushback, especially in more exposed economies, politicians are really under very heavy pressure. So just finally, very quickly, so what we did in IPAC last year at the Taipei Summit, our Taipei Summit in July, was we agreed a model resolution pushing back against Beijing's distortion of 2758. And what parliamentarians have done following that in 7 parliaments now around the world is they have passed motions. Very finally, those motions are not just a statement of parliamentary initiative. In many cases, they had to be agreed with the governing party. For example, in the Australian Senate, Penny Wong had to approve the text. So they don't just come as a statement of parliamentary rebellion. They are very often a restatement of government policy, and that is not that's not an inconsiderable achievement, and it's one which I think is very useful for trying to reassert what 2758 is and isn't. I think I'll leave it there, Marcin. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Luke. Those who are watchers of Taiwan's foreign policy understand very well that legislative or parliamentary diplomacy has been crucial to circumventing Taiwan's international isolation, and your remarks about broad awareness-making benefits of engaging with parliaments on China advocacy and advocacy related to China-Taiwan affairs definitely further contribute to these existing findings about the crucial role of parliaments. Now, moving on, I would like to invite Professor Lewis to share how the PRC's campaign on UN 2758 relates to other form of its lawfare. Please.
Well, thanks, Marcin, and good afternoon from Taiwan. I really appreciate this panel that we're spanning the UK and Taiwan, as well as law and politics, which is so important. So I do, with that great table setting that we got from both Yujie and Luke, want to just pull back a little bit. But I'm going to start by reading something from an April Security Council ARIA formula meeting that my government said, in part because there's not a lot that my government says recently that I'm excited to read aloud. So I'm going to go with this. So they said that we, the United States, underline China's misuse of UN General Assembly Resolution 2758 in its attempts to isolate Taiwan, mischaracterize other countries' policies, and constrain their choices. This resolution does not preclude Taiwan's meaningful participation in the UN system and other multilateral fora. So just to emphasize how we need multiple branches of government to really keep reiterating these messages in multiple fora. And so one thing I really want to get across is that the misuse of 2758, I think of as a symptom of a much bigger issue, this idea of lawfare. And lawfare, it sounds really cool, it's used a lot, and there's some various views about what that really means. And going back to some of the earlier use of that by Major General Charles Dunlap of the United States, as a strategy of using or misusing law as a substitute for traditional military means to achieve an operational objective, right? Not just lobbying bombs and bullets, but using law as a tool. Now, in the context of the PRC, I think that law sometimes needs to be in scare quotes. And I say this as a lawyer because some of the laws that we're dealing with that the PRC is using include their domestic laws, some of which violate international human rights norms and other bases on which I think we should be pushing back about their status as whether these are laws that should be respected outside the borders. So we're in 2025. Rewind 20 years to the anti-secession law, just celebrated its 20th anniversary with a big gathering in Beijing. Now, the anti-secession law is an odd law. It's only 10 articles long, one of which is the effective date. And it's really more of a policy statement that goes back to the Chen Shui-bian era here of saying we're going to hope for unification or reunification, as it's usually said in English. And if it really gets to the point that either Taiwan declares legal independence, or it is clear that there's no way that the PRC, that China is going to actually take control of Taiwan, we could use non-peaceful means, euphemism for force. And so that's been in effect for 20 years. Again, it was just emphasized. But I'd also like to point out a year ago, almost exactly, we had issued by the PRC an interpretation, so it's a judicial interpretation of the criminal law of the PRC, which includes a provision on anti-secession or anti-separatist. And so for people who are trying to, as Beijing sees it, separate out Taiwan from China, that there can be very harsh penalties up to the death penalty. And Yujie knows these cases better than I do, but we've seen 2 sentencings under this law that are really of note. One of a Taiwan citizen who had been held in Beijing or held in China for several years before being sentenced to 9 years last year, and another sentencing of a publisher who's a resident of Taiwan, not a citizen of the ROC, but certainly the chilling effect. And even this interpretation clarifying what it is to be a separatist includes advocating for Taiwan's participation in international organizations. So Yujie and I have had conversations, I guess, that we could be prosecuted under Article 103. So let's all say this isn't just about a UN General Assembly resolution and how that's being misused by China. It's part of this much bigger suite of tools that Beijing is using to, first of all, try to get the international community to adhere to its one China principle, as opposed to the one China policies that many countries have, including the United States, as well as now against individuals, to really create that fear, that chilling effect for individuals who are going to stand up for these. And just finally, I want to make sure we can get to discussion soon, but I think too that when we talk about lawfare, we should also recognize the importance of normfare, the shaping of international norms. And this is something which Beijing is not only trying to shape how the international community views the status of Taiwan, of course, under the one China policy that the United States has, and this is similar in some other countries, that the US acknowledges the PRC's position. Yeah, we hear you. We hear that's what you're saying. The US does not recognize the PRC's the way that they see Taiwan as part of the PRC. But with the norm changing that's going on, for example, we're seeing the PRC suck out the civil and political rights from the conversation on the international level, and instead just wanting to say, hey, as long as you've got a house and a school and something to eat, we're not going to worry, and we're going to deprioritize these issues with freedom of speech and freedom of participation in your government. So we can focus on 2758 to a certain extent. That is so crucially important, but I don't want to get too myopic and not see how this fits into a much bigger issue.
Thank you very much for encouraging us to take a broader view. I believe that this notion of discussing lawfare in conjunction with normfare is particularly relevant to many of the conversations about policymaking and policy implementation with regard to European external action. And given that we are a European entity as today's host, and that a number of our viewers today are Europe-based, this is perhaps an important point of reflection, as in the European Union external policy making, we see an increasing shift towards pragmatism and a renegotiation of Europe's traditional role as a normative power and regulatory power. It is important to consider the potential voids that might be left and which Beijing might seek to fill amid this pragmatic turn. Thank you very much for all of your remarks. I would like to get us started with one of the questions that actually came from the audience, but I think it ties some of the threads that you mentioned together. So one of our audience members was wondering to what extent the distortion of UN 2758 and broader efforts by the PRC to gain a stronger foothold within United Nations system could be used in unison with more kinetic hostile efforts towards a takeover for Taiwan. So to what extent do you think that UN 2758 and its distortion are an effort to seek legal grounds for kinetic action vis-a-vis Taiwan? And how far is this becoming a consensus in the international community? And would anyone like to start?
I'll start the conversation. So in my remarks, I've already mentioned that 2758 is not only impacted in Taiwan's international participation. I do think it's a way by Beijing to frame a potential Taiwan contingency as an internal domestic affairs of the PRC, so that if there's any international intervention, Beijing will definitely see that as illegal and contested in UN and beyond. And we also see that not only occurring in the narrative, not only taking place in the discussion of 2758, but in broader discussion, including the anti-secession law that Maggie talked about. And we should not forget that that law was passed 20 years ago. So this is a long-term narrative trying to create an environment where China's aggression can go unpunished. So we do need to see this not just about the current event, but also about the potential conflict across the Taiwan Strait. One last thing is China tries to frame Taiwan's question as, anti-secession, as the anti-secession law suggests. But Taiwan's case is not about secession. I'm a lawyer. I take law seriously. If we look at the San Francisco Peace Treaty, Taiwan's sovereign title was not transferred to Chinese state after World War II. So it's really, Taiwan's title has never belonged to the PRC, according to the post-World War II legal arrangement. So there's no so-called parent state in Taiwan's case. China should not be protected as a parent state. Its territorial integrity is not at stake in Taiwan's case, and Taiwan's people should decide their own future. And we have effectively in Taiwan exercised self-determination to see ourselves as a state. And that's how we should talk about Taiwan, not in the framing of China's secession from China, but instead in the framing and but in line with the values of self-determination and human rights and democracy.
Thank you very much, Uje, for sharing these remarks. I think that your mention of the Treaty of San Francisco and references to the post-World War II international order are quite interesting, and I would like to bring it back once again to the European context, and specifically the Central European context. Recently, Polish Foreign Minister Radosław Sikorski and his Chinese counterpart Wang Yi had a phone call, and while the Polish readout is still not available, the Chinese readout emphasized that Taiwan was very firmly on the agenda. Poland is now gearing up for the runoff in presidential elections, which could potentially result in at least some adjustment to relations with China amid Poland's expansion of pragmatic ties with Taiwan, particularly in the economic domain. And according to the Chinese readout itself, Wang Yi emphasized that the Chinese side viewed the status of Taiwan as a part of China, as an element, as a continuation of the post-World War II international order. So I think that this is contributing to your point about UN 2758 not being an isolated instrument, but rather a part of a longer-term strategy, which is also something that Maggie shed light on with the connection that she made between UN 2758 and the anti-secession law. But enough from me. Luke, please.
Thank you. I want to associate myself very, very strongly with what Uje and Maggie both said, but also to point out that there is something of a vacuum at the moment. I'm going where angels fear to tread here with on a call with a bunch of international lawyers. But it seems to me that there are a number of ambiguities that are creating space for Beijing's distortion of 2758 to exploit. For example, we're still very unclear about the status of a blockade of Taiwan in international law, and a number of politicians have asked about this. Normally, this would be understood as an act of war in international law, but ambiguity around Taiwan means that that isn't at all clear. And I can quite see some of the larger democracies around the world hiding behind that to excuse their inertia in the event of escalation. And there's a vacuum there. And what steps into that vacuum? Well, it's Beijing saying, well, hang on a second, we've got this document which gives us legitimacy and gives us at least some claim to sovereignty. And that's not at all helpful. So I think that, yes, it matters a lot. I think it's strongly connected because there is a vacuum around some of these questions and Beijing's trying to fill it. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And just a reminder for our audience, we are approaching the Q&A portion of the event. So please make sure to share any questions that you might have in the chat box or in the comment section. Maggie, do you have any response to Ije and Luke?
Yeah, it's not as much a response as just adding on. And with the question of a blockade, two in the conversation is what if it wasn't a full blockade, but some sort of quarantine, some sort of using pretextual, it's because of public health, it's because of something having to do with agriculture, who knows? I can't even begin to spin out the ways that Beijing might try to up what is already so much activity around Taiwan. I mean, when I first came here 20 years ago, Beijing couldn't get further than half a tank of gas could take it from its shores. Right now we have a blue water navy. I'm spending most of my time this year in Australia. Didn't expect in February that we would see live fire drills in the Tasman Sea. And to be fair, right, I believe in freedom of navigation and there are laws of the sea and we have transits from the United States and other governments through the Taiwan Strait, which I think are fantastic to emphasize that is an international strait through which they can transit. But there's a lot, yes, so there's a lot of international law ambiguities, but there's also the lawyer in me wants to talk about that, and the person who's here and not Taiwanese but cares very deeply about this place wants to talk about just the level of hardware that Beijing is putting around Taiwan and the airs, on the water on a daily basis. And so I think there's this two-pronged strategy of Beijing of let us have a legal argument, and there are exploiting ambiguities. At the same time, we're going to keep ratcheting up the pressure so you are fully aware, people of Taiwan, how much power and might we have behind us in 2025 and going forward. And for this too, I know a lot of people watching this have a pretty deep understanding of Taiwan, but I think it's always important to emphasize too how the 23-ish million people who call Taiwan their home have increasingly seen themselves as Taiwanese. First came here, especially after the PRC was first established in 1949 and the Republic of China government came over. A lot of people who came over, the couple million with Chiang Kai-shek, thought of themselves as Chinese, and that was their main identifying characteristics. Some identify as both, but overwhelmingly over this 75 years, there's been a real development of Taiwanese identity, both among the people who were here before the late 1940s and those who came after and have generations that follow them. So I also don't want to lose that self-determination, those values of what do the people here want for their future.
Thank you very much. So, yes, Yujie, please.
Could I follow up on what Luke just said about ambiguities? Taiwan's legal status is a very contentious issue under international law. It's a prominent case of what we call contested states, states entities who basically meets all criterion for statehood, but that is not universally recognized by a lot of states. That's the typical definition of a contested state. So Taiwan, of course, has population, has territory, has an effective government, can interact with other nations. All these criteria for statehood, there's no question about it. Taiwan's satisfaction of all these requirements. However, it's not widely recognized. So this is the legal ambiguity that we're dealing with, and also a major legal vulnerability of Taiwan's in terms of pushing back China's narrative. But here I want to say that, even for a contested state like Taiwan, it still should be protected under international law, including the non-use of force principle. So Luke and Maggie mentioned different scenarios, including a blockade across the Taiwan Strait. If we look at international legal scholarship, the non-use of force principle not only applies to well-recognized states, but contested states as well. There's an emergent scholarship discussing this. And we all know contested states are actually the places where these conflicts constantly happen. And so it makes sense to apply international law protection to the Taiwan scenario. I think we should separate two very different questions, although they are interrelated. One is the question of Taiwan's statehood, Taiwan's legal status, and the other is whether Taiwan should be protected by international law, including non-use of force principle. And even for those scholars who do not necessarily agree that Taiwan is a state, they also recognize there should be a boundary between China and Taiwan in terms of protecting Taiwan from China's use of force. So I do think this is a very important point for all countries to consider. A lot of countries do not recognize Taiwan, and that's okay. Even despite their non-recognition in a Taiwan contingency, they should still recognize international law's protection to Taiwan.
Thank you very much. Perhaps we can bring this conversation more to the issue of Chinese influence over international organizations, and particularly the United Nations system. So the distortion of UN 2758 has an effect on Taiwan's ability to participate meaningfully, for example, as an observer in various fora. This conversation is happening 2 days after Taiwan was excluded for the 9th consecutive time from the World Health Assembly, despite a precedent between 2009 and 2016, when it was invited to this preeminent global health forum as an observer. So I have 2 questions here. The first one is more general. To what extent has UN 2758 in your experience been used specifically to challenge Taiwan's ability to participate in UN bodies even as an observer? And secondly, why should Taiwan care about this participation if we see that Chinese influence over these bodies is growing? So to what extent do they still really align with the objectives that Taiwan is seeking to pursue? What is the point of this advocacy for meaningful participation in international fora and particularly UN bodies? Would anyone like to start?
I can start and then kick it over to you, Jean-Luc. But so the World Health Assembly, and I just first want to emphasize that global health, the pandemic is still in our recent memories. The fact that that Taiwan, which had such a tremendous contribution in PPE and sending masks, not just having them for their own people, but sending them abroad, and such a wealth of information and knowledge, and that to have them excluded hurts everyone in the world. Also, organizations like ICAO, civil aviation. I say as someone who's usually in New Jersey, and look at what's happened in Newark Airport recently. It is really important that we have rules of the road and great communication. So this is also, we really have to think about, this is about big public values that span borders. Now, part of it is this exclusion from the meetings, right? From World Health Assembly, ICAO, other international organizations. But again, it is about this broader, that it essentially erases Taiwan. The less seats that they have, the less voice that they have. You can't even physically get into the UN spaces as a Taiwanese. So it's an exclusion on so many different levels. And this is something where, too, if there is a vacuum, if the United States, if other, especially other Security Council members, other, powerful voices on the international stage do not stand up, China's filling that void. It's filling that void in the more public fora, but also in some of these really just, inside baseball, nitty gritty, various lower level bureaucracy of the UN, where you get things like, I've been watching the right to development be termed in by China in ways that are favorable to their worldview. So I think we need to really think of this, not just there's once a year a big meeting, but this is something that's an exclusion that is permeating various levels of the UN, other international organizations, 365 days a year.
Thank you. Would anyone like to follow up on this? Yeah, Yuji, please.
I'll follow up and say that in this year's WHA discussion about Taiwan, I think there's some progress we see happening. I think countries in support of Taiwan's participation in the WHA, they started to use to clarify the meaning of UNGA Resolution 2758 and WHA's resolution that basically is a copy of 2758. And they clarified that this is about China's representation, not about Taiwan's legal status and not about Taiwan's right to participate in the international system. And I think that's very helpful clarification. Having said that, Taiwan is still prevented from taking part in this year's WHA. So obviously clarifying 2758 is not enough. It's not sufficient, but it's a necessary first step. But I do think our discussion about Taiwan have to go beyond the discussion of 2758 and think about different legal and political strategies to allow Taiwan to be in. And this needs support. Clarifying 2758 was a great necessary first step, and we need to move beyond that. And the second question is, why is Taiwan so eager to participate? I think for really good reasons. Taiwan, as an important player in the world, has to take part in the global governance that matters to its 23 million people. And so this is really about the right of Taiwanese people to be able to take part in global issues, on discussions of global issues that have an impact on us in Taiwan. And the second reason, very important, is this: in the face of China's threat, I talked about legal vulnerability, but of course, because of China's political influence, Taiwan has a lot of political vulnerabilities as well. In order to overcome these political and legal vulnerabilities, Taiwan has to have its voices heard on international platforms. And if Taiwan is kept out of the system, we have to rely on others to speak for us. But this is not, I mean, to really honor Taiwan's agency, I think Taiwan should have a place to speak about itself. Thank you.
Thank you. And Luke, would you like to add anything?
Yes, please. Just to point out that we believe, and I think we've seen, that Beijing has an emerging economy strategy here. They behave more aggressively in places where they think they can, particularly around interpretation of 2758. You could say that they're sort of more maximalist in their imposition of their interpretation in places that are more exposed to their leverage. So we've seen this play out all over the world, in fact. So the three countries that were bullied out of IPAC recently, which were Malawi, the Gambia, and very recently the Solomon Islands, in every case, I think it's probably not pushing things too far to say that I do not think that Beijing would dare try to tell elected legislators who they could associate with in more advanced economies. They're picking off the people who are particularly exposed to them and demanding that they walk the line of their interpretation of 2758. The reason I want to highlight this is that I think against the backdrop of what appears to be a bit of a US retreat from the, let's call it the hybrid warfare or soft power stage, that I would predict getting considerably worse over coming years. And I'm not really sure that we have a strategy to be able to shore up countries that are a bit more exposed to that imposition of this very maximalist interpretation of Beijing's understanding of 2758. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I can already see that we have some questions from the audience, so let's make sure that we address these. One audience member is calling Taiwan shameless, so let's take it as a compliment. But we also have a more productive question about evaluating the success of action pursued with regard to combating Chinese lawfare or addressing issues such as distortion of UN 2758. So how do you think we should measure the efficacy of these advocacy campaigns? What are any risks that might be behind it? And whether you think that this type of advocacy might ignite more aggressive behavior from the PRC?
I feel that maybe I should attempt to come back to that one. So there are a couple of things about this. I think anybody who is working on Taiwan-related advocacy, particularly in foreign parliaments, has to be very, very careful. And we try to be, and certainly make sure that the stuff that they are doing accords with what the people of Taiwan seem to want. So we try to make sure that whenever we are pursuing campaigns, this is stuff which is wanted locally, because we believe that the people of Taiwan are better placed to judge that than we are. So I think the risks always have to be weighed very carefully in answer to the first thing. In answer to the other part of the question, efficacy. Efficacy in the advocacy world is hard to manage at the best of times, hard to measure at the best of times, sorry. But I think one thing you can certainly do is view it through the lens of stopping things from getting worse. Where would we be if there were not a governmental pushback? Well, we'd be in a place where Beijing's continual expansion of their, or continual imposition of their interpretation of 2758 would be unchallenged. And we've seen what happens when authoritarian behavior goes unchallenged. It simply continues to expand. Its expansion is by its nature. So it's very important there's resistance to stop things from getting worse, and that is a form of efficacy. However, it's also important to say that because there has been such a period of time between, I think, Beijing being very much more aggressive in terms of its international projection of its understanding of 2758, a lot of ground has been lost. And there are a lot of democracies that are, let's say, not the sort of Five Eyes lot and not the very exposed lot, but a lot of others in the middle, who could easily be persuaded one way or the other because they thought that there wasn't much difference. I mean, why would they really care? Does it really matter? And we've got this big partner who matters a lot to us in terms of trade and investment, and they really want this. So is there any skin off our nose, really, and just going with what they want? So that huge number of countries in the middle, many of which still have not expressed an opinion on 2758, are, I would say, very much in play. And we can't simply allow those countries to descend into adopting Beijing's definition. So there's efficacy in preventing that from happening. And there's certainly efficacy in restating the position that 2758 doesn't say what Beijing wants it to. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Of course, given that your work focused quite a lot on advocacy, it is very valuable for us to hear your thoughts on the question of measurement of efficacy of these campaigns. But I wonder whether our two panelists from the research community have something to add on this point as well. Yujie, please.
Could I say from Taiwan's Taiwanese as a Taiwanese from looking from my perspective of looking at what's going on in the past few years about 2758, it was really encouraging to see the developments. And I think we really must give credit to many international actors, including IPAC and other groups and international scholars who work very hard to really push back China's narrative. And as Luke said, if it's not pushed back, then it goes as unchallenged and taken for granted and accepted within the international system. And so I think as a Taiwanese looking at this, I feel very excited and I feel excited about talking about 2758, not because I'm a lawyer, but because it really matters to Taiwan and matters to Taiwan's role in the world. So I would say this is one of the very, very rare examples of success when it comes to advocacy for Taiwan's agency and autonomy. Thank you.
So I would just add that I think it's so important that the people who are not Taiwanese are allies and not as informal treaty allies, just someone who lifts up the voices and makes sure that their voices are heard. Because, for example, in the international media, I've been so heartened to see in recent years that we are seeing so much more reporting on Taiwan and from people in Taiwan. So it's not just Taiwan is this place out there, unsinkable aircraft carrier, but giving Taiwan and the people here agency. And so that is so valuable, and that needs to continue. I'd say too, I started with something I liked about my government. Now I'll say I read the speech when Trump went to Saudi Arabia, and I just to see the U.S. government disappear from advocating for human rights and democracy, and these are values that are universal values, is painful to hear. However, I do a lot of work with civil society and friends at the ACLU are in courts right now in the U.S. And so I think this is a time that it's embattled some of these values, certainly in ways, but people shouldn't feel powerless, even though it's a hard time.
Thank you very much for this. And in your remarks about advocacy and measuring efficacy of advocacy, you have commented a lot about the importance of centering the perspective of Taiwanese people. Maggie, you previously commented on the changing dynamics and self-identification and the consolidation of distinct Taiwanese identity. Yujie, you emphasized that Taiwan's quest to meaningfully engage with international fora is a question of rights of Taiwanese people who are already contributing to safeguarding global public goods. But I wonder if you could comment in any extent that you feel comfortable about the perception of the UN 2758 issue in Taiwan. To what extent do you think it's mentioned in the information space, and to what extent do we see consensus on this discussion within Taiwan?
So I'll talk first. This is not an easy conversation to have in Taiwan. It's very ironic, I think, when parliaments from all over the world are starting to clarify and debunk the myth of 2758 for Taiwan. Taiwan's own legislature cannot come up with its own version of clarifying what 2758 really means for Taiwan. The Taiwan government is very clear about 2758 not being relevant to Taiwan's status. However, we know that Taiwan's legislature is now dominated by the blue camp, the KMT, with the forces of the TPP, the Taiwan People's Party. So the DPP government, the governing party, is not in the majority. And you see a lot of struggles in the legislature because of this, while the Taiwan government is eager to push for a certain agenda, that agenda that may not align with the agenda of the opposition groups will not be passed in the legislature. And this is where we are with 2758, which is that the Taiwan government has been clear that to thank the international support for Taiwan on clarifying 2758. On the other hand, the blue camp cannot agree with the green camp, the DPP ruling party, to come up with a consensus to say this is not relevant to Taiwan. And this is a much more complicated question, but I want to say that there's an element in Taiwan society still struggling to identify clearly as a Taiwanese and Taiwan state, but that portion is diminishing. But the political influence by the KMT in support with that kind of a different identity is still strong in the political circles. However, I want to come back to the point that Maggie referred to earlier. As time passes, we see the proportion of people who identify themselves as Taiwanese have steadily increased, and that's a majority opinion. But we do, as a democracy, we do need to work on resolving our different opinions. And this is what I think Taiwan's legislature has to continue to work on.
I just want to add here that even though there is the blue-white dominated legislature right now, KMT, and there's differences of opinions, vociferous ones, between the different parties here, one thing that is really shared across people here is an overwhelming desire for the status quo. The percentage of the population of Taiwan who wants to actually unify with the PRC is a sliver. And as you just said, the percentage that wants to stand up tomorrow and say we are now the Republic of Taiwan is very small. And if you're interested in these issues, I can't say enough good things about the work of some great political scientists, Lev Nachman, Wei Ting-yen, Shelley Rigger, who are doing a great job of both looking at surveys over time, but also focus groups. And so overwhelmingly, the people of Taiwan have said loud and clear, we want the status quo. That's the best we can get under the intense pressure that they face daily.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we are almost out of time. I believe that during the 60-minute discussion on UN 2758, we were able to cover much more ground than just understanding what the resolution is and what it isn't, and understanding how China seeks to instrumentalize it amid its efforts to asphyxiate Taiwan's efforts to meaningfully engage with the international community. The conversation allowed us to understand more about overall efforts by China to undermine the idea of universalism of human rights, and also to increase its footprint on UN institutions. Additionally, I appreciated remarks from our speakers about the importance of taking not only a whole of society, but also a whole of government approach in Taiwan advocacy, and calling out Chinese efforts at legal warfare, as evidenced, for instance, by IPAC's campaign engaging legislatures. And of course, the key message here is, and as it always should be in Taiwan advocacy, that we should put the agency of Taiwanese people first, and understand that the questions of Taiwanese identity are organic, ever-changing, and owned by no one other than the people of Taiwan. Thank you very much to our audience for tuning in. The video of this webinar will be available for your further perusal on YouTube, and I encourage you to stay in touch with the European Values Center for Security Policy, either by following our social media or subscribing to our bilingual English and Czech fortnightly Indo-Pacific Currents briefing. In the Indo-Pacific Currents briefing, we also discuss the issue of UN 2758 and other issues related to Chinese legal warfare quite extensively, so it might provide you with some further material if you're interested in learning more about this issue. Thank you very much also to our panelists for sharing your incredibly important and nuanced insights on this topic. Stay safe and goodbye.